We are live.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Would you go ahead and call the roll?
Yes. Dr. Blanton?
Here.
Dr. Bullock? Dr. Dempsey?
Present.
Dr. Fleming?
Present.
Ms. Edwards?
Present. Good morning, everybody.
Morning. Dr. Graham? Dr. Houston? Dr. Locklear? Dr. Marr?
Present.
Dr. Elliott?
Here. Good morning.
Dr. Penfield?
Present.
Superintendent Truitt? Ms. Carper? Dr. Holland?
Good morning.
Dr. Weddington? Dr. Griffin?
Present.
Mr. Smith?
Present. Good morning.
Mr. Patton? We have quorum.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Evans. And we'll call the meeting to order. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the March 9th, 2023 monthly meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This Standards Commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation, licensure, continuing education, and professional standards of North Carolina educators. I am Van Dempsey, Chair of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Commission members, you have had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the March 9th, 2023 meeting?
This is Randy. I move to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the agenda. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The agenda is approved. The minutes from our previous commission meeting on February 16th, 2023 have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
Madison, I motion.
Do I have a second?
Second. Go Griffin.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. We have approved the minutes. Now, Dr. Evans and I will present the NCDPI and the state board updates.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to let you know that I sent out a link to all the members this morning, a link to the presentations for the State of the Teaching Profession report, the EPB performance reporting, and also the Pepsi motion that Dr. Dempsey will be talking about a little bit later. And that's so that we can go right into our informational item and our policy amendments this morning. And so I just wanted to let you know that the State of the Teaching Profession report and the EPP performance reporting were both unanimously approved by the state board during the March meeting. Any questions? Dr. Holland.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. I would like to know, in our human capital webinar last week, Dr. Tomerlin, we had with Dr. Tomerlin, there was a discussion among the HR leadership about the concerning data around international faculty educators in the teaching profession report and their turnover data. I would like for, if we don't have it today, maybe at our next meeting, an update on that information and what's been found, so that it can be accurately reflected regarding turnover. The numbers there are very concerning and don't reflect the actual IFE numbers in the state. And I feel like it gives a bad impression of the programs that we have operating in the state for cultural exchange.
Dr. Tomberlin, do you want to say anything about that?
Yes. So we have triple and quadruple checked these numbers, and it really comes down to the number of folks with that license, with an international faculty license, who are employed in a LEA. So the State of the Teaching Profession report does not cover charter schools. And so there's two things at play here. Without the if the international faculty teacher is not appropriately licensed as international faculty, we won't have a record of that, and we won't be able to include them in that metric. Also, if they're employed in a charter school, we have no way to that the report doesn't extend to charter school payroll. The report is specifically for traditional LEAs. So the numbers that we reported were accurate for the data that we were able to collect. There's a choice here for next year's reporting. We can try to do things differently to collect better data on this, but I think the agency is probably leaning towards not reporting at all on international faculty and or TFA, because they are not required reporting elements in the report under the statute, and it may be to our advantage just to not address it and try to address. We can certainly work with international faculty and our J-1 visa providers to provide help verify information about the participation in the programs and where those folks are. But I think it's probably not appropriate for the State of Teaching Profession report because of its focus solely on LEAs. And we know that charter schools have a significant IF population. So that's what we know about it now.
And Dr. Tomberlin, this is Aaron Fleming. I'll go along with Ann a little bit. And if you say it will not be reported, then that makes this suggestion or thought kind of mute. But do you, well, let me ask this way. For example, here in Harnett County, we use a variety of vendors, service providers for our international faculty. We have noticed that probably our turnover with some providers are higher than others. And then I also know that some LEAs, we don't, but I know some LEAs either have the opportunity or also sponsor their own international faculty members. My question is there any way, if we are going to report that, can we break it down by either provider or LEA sponsored or anything like that?
Yes, I think that's all possible. I don't want to discount the significant contribution that international faculty make to the teaching force in North Carolina. That's not my intent of not including it in the State of the Teaching Profession report. If the goal of the field is to recognize this contribution and to understand the impact of this pathway on the human capital pipeline, I think that's certainly a worthy endeavor and certainly something that the board may be interested in, regardless of whether it's a General Assembly required report or not. Our division would be happy to engage with our J-1 visa providers and our districts and our charter schools to help understand the accurate contribution that these teachers are making to the pipeline. So when I say we're considering not doing it in the State of the Teaching Profession report, that is not meant to indicate the exclusion of any kind of reporting relative to this pipeline stream, which I agree is very important, and it doesn't give me any pleasure to have to report the way I did this time, because I mean we went back and forth on this many times before it ever appeared in draft, even because the numbers were just not sensical to me. So I'm happy to work on this and think of other ways that we could report on the contribution of these folks. It just doesn't seem to be a good fit for the State of the Teaching Profession report because of the way that it's constructed.
And I also think, and I don't want to go, thank you for that. I think that is great. I don't want to, I don't want to take up our meeting time and discuss things that are not within the realm of Pep C, but since I have you on the phone, I'm also curious, some places, and I'm going to use Harnett again, just so everybody knows why I'm saying this. We have a significant portion of teachers that are in and out because they receive PCSs in the middle of the year, they're military impacted, and I don't know, and I know this is probably a legislative thing that the General Assembly would maybe need to ask for this specific data, but I'm very worried because I don't believe there is any type of I think there is a resign because of military, but I wish there was a way we could report that maybe leaving because of military is not something that was the choice of the teacher, where leaving to go from an LEA to another LEA or leaving the teaching profession altogether was the choice of the educator. If you get where I'm going, I don't know if there's a way to report it out where sometimes life happens and other times we just decide to leave the profession. And so I don't know if there's ever a way to break that out. And I don't know if I'm articulating that the way I need to, but I also want to be careful in the way I say that too.
Sure. Just so I'm understanding, you're talking attrition and or mobility in general and reasons related to that?
Like if there was a way to say, okay, your turnover rate is X, but we also understand that when you take out a military move, it takes your turnover down to this number. Because I think I'm assuming the original purpose of the teacher turnover rate was to see how many people, really were turning over in the profession as far as leaving the profession. And I don't know that if a teacher gets a military order because a spouse is being PCS to another base somewhere, that they're necessarily leaving the profession. Or, we don't always know, even if it's state to state, for leaving the profession, but we know where they can mark that on their form that, there's a code for that, leaving the profession. And I believe there's one too for military, but I wish there's a way you could report people leaving the profession, and then when you take out, I guess, the mobility piece, when you take that out, it would reduce your turnover rate to a certain amount.
Dr. Holland, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate Dr. Tomerlin. We talked about the data and how it's pulled from multiple systems. I just think that when the HR group was asking last week, we recognize that there are a lot more international exchange teachers that are operating in the state. And they all, to my knowledge, go through each of the three vendors, large vendors, go through a process to apply for their individuals to have a license through the licensing division at DPI. So where that data is disconnected is a concern. There were also comments made at the state board table the day the presentation was made about the very high turnover rate that was presented there. And while I understand that the data is what the data is, it's concerned that there were comments about this high turnover. And I think that some people perceive that negatively. And I don't think that that's what anyone intended necessarily, but that may be how it was perceived. So that's part of the reason for my request. I think that the programs that operate, and to your point, they're greatly appreciated. And I know that you and the team at DPI recognize that. I want us to figure out the data and where there's a disconnect so that it can be reflected accurately. There was a great deal of work that went into this, and it would just be nice if it were presented with accurate numbers. Oh, sorry, wrong button.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dr. Tomlin, can we, if there are updates between now and the April meeting, can we ask that you might share those if they become available?
So there won't be any updates. That report was approved by the board in March. So it will, the report will be what it is, and we can certainly communicate to the JLEOC that these numbers may not accurately reflect the entire population and the attrition of international faculty in the state of North Carolina.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions on that item? I do want to share one additional piece. I met with the State Board of Education last week and moved the motion that was approved by Pepsi in the February meeting to the State Board of Education for their consideration in the further development of the piloting process for the Pathways Initiative. That motion and report from Pepsi was positively received by the board. The State Board also considered a document that is in the link for this meeting today. Its title is Request by the North Carolina State Board of Education to the North Carolina General Assembly authorizing the creation of a pilot program to study a new teacher licensure system. That document's on the screen now. That document is part of the action that was considered by the State Board of Education last week. And so that will move forward, and we will await further communication from the board as they begin their discussions with the General Assembly and with the Department of Public Instruction for activity that comes back to Pepsi. Any questions about that step in this process? Any other information or comment, Dr. Evans?
That is all for the updates.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to welcome the following to present the Transforming Educator Learning in North Carolina, Realizing the Potential of Micro-Credentials report. The report authors, Dr. G. Williamson McDermott, Alumni Distinguished Professor of Education, Emeritus, former Dean of the School of Education at UNC, Dr. Barnett Berry, Research Professor, University of South Carolina, and Senior Research Fellow, Learning Policy Institute, Mary Dean Behringer, Principal Consultant at Learning Revolutions, LLC, former Vice President of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, and advisors to the report, Dr. Tom Tomlin, Dr. Ashley McBride from Digital Learning Consultant, NCDPI, and Myra Best, Executive Director of Digital Learn. For a little bit of context for this report, this is a report that is going to the General Assembly. We were made aware, Dr. Fleming and I were made aware of this at our last check-in meeting to prepare the agenda for today. We thought it would be beneficial for Pepsi for this to, at this point, to come before Pepsi as an information item. As a result of this presentation today, I'll communicate to the State Board of Education Chair that we have seen this presentation and are aware of this discussion as this work continues to move forward and whatever connections it may have back to Pepsi. are determined in the future. But I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Chair Dempsey, and welcome to the members of PEPC to this report. I'm Myra Best. I'm the Executive Director of DigiLearn. And we're delighted to be here on behalf of my colleagues. We're delighted to be here today to share with you the work of the Microcredentials Partnership of State, of which North Carolina is a member. To give you a little bit of background of this work, DigiLearn partnered with the North Carolina State Board of Ed in 2020 with the goal to investigate the use of microcredentials as a tool for teacher retention and development. And through that work, we did a lot of national research, and we found that many states are already doing a lot of microcredentials. A lot are already being done in North Carolina, but the states are challenged with how to effectively implement microcredentials. And so as we got into this work, the main issue that seemed to be a challenge is what is the impact of data around microcredentials, and that research is very thin. There seemed to be a need for some consistency and quality assurance standards, and also around policy, state-level policy, to implement microcredentials. So that led to the formation of the Microcredentials Partnership of State, and each of the states in the partnership have a different direction they're taking with how they're implementing microcredentials. And for the purposes of today, the Transforming Educator Learning in North Carolina, Realizing the Potential of Microcredentials, is the direction that Ashley McBride and Tom Tomberlin chose to take for North Carolina, and enlisted our important my colleagues that will be giving the report for you today. At this point in time, the Microcredentials Partnership of State has developed a common definition for microcredentials. We've also developed a set of quality assurance standards for state use. Those are in the process of being validated, and they should be ready for use by July of this year. So if you go to the next slide, Kim. The outcomes for our meeting today is to help create some understanding of what microcredentials are and how they can be used to improve educator practice and student learning, but they need to be integrated into the state's professional learning system. And also look at some recommendations for how to implement a state-supported system for microcredentials. And then finally, Tom and Ashley are going to talk a little bit about the understanding of how the Transforming Educator Learning in North Carolina report informs the pathways to excellence for teaching professionals. And I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Bill McDermott, which may not be a stranger to many of you here, to begin the report.
Thank you, Myra, and thanks to everyone. I appreciate the chance for us to talk about this report we've done. The question we pose here is, why does North Carolina need microcredentials? Well, one of the obvious responses is that North Carolina needs well-qualified educators who are going to stay in the profession and who are motivated to continually improve their practice. And we need educators who fit that description, particularly in low-wealth counties and communities. When researchers have asked teachers what would help them stay in the profession, they've talked about not just salaries and improved working conditions, but a greater sense of autonomy, of professional autonomy over their lives. And microcredentials offer that kind of a promise of increased educators' sense of efficacy and control over their professional lives. And it seems to improve their desire to remain in their jobs. And as you see on the screen, and Myra referred to this, the Microcredentials Partnership of the States has developed a definition of what a microcredential is. And this is of particular interest because of the potential of the microcredential partnership to enable some transportability of micro-credentials. But the definition that you see on the screen has important elements in it. One of the most important being the need to distinguish micro-credentials as a verification of proficiencies in a job embedded discrete set of skills or competency. That is to say, micro-credentials aren't a curriculum. They're not a body of learning resources. Rather, they are a way using a valid method to affirm that educators have demonstrated in their classrooms mastery over a particular skill or competency. And now I'll turn it over to Barnett.
Thank you, Bill, and it's a pleasure to be with all my North Carolina colleagues. As some of you know, spent a fair amount of time, well over 2 decades in the Tar Heel State, even though if you could see me now, I'm wearing some of my Gamecock garnet and black right now. That said, Bill did mention, and Myra did as well, about some research that has been conducted around micro-credentials across the country. And part of our report spends some time in synthesizing the existing evidence, as well as drawing on the insights from several dozen North Carolina educators. Bill mentioned the importance of working conditions and its impact on teacher retention and student learning. I'd like to turn just briefly to, with this slide right in front of you, to a study that both Bill and I were a part of as part of the Learning Policy Institute's work several years back in support of the deliberations of the Leandro Commission. That report examined working conditions data in North Carolina and then linked school level data around teachers' reports of working conditions to actual retention rates as well as school performance. And what I'd like to say is that some of the primary factors that led to stronger retention and better school performance absolutely parallel to some of the power and potential of micro-credentials. And what were those findings from this study? First and foremost, if you want to keep teachers and help them improve student learning, 1, you need to build collective teacher efficacy. 2, you need to recognize teachers as experts, support them to meet high standards, and involve them in critical decision-making. And the professional learning they experience needs to be collaborative, readily available, useful, focused on practice, and aligned with school improvement goals. And if micro-credentials are implemented effectively, and Mary Dean's going to have some recommendations for us in just a bit, if they are, they will absolutely mirror those same factors that we know will improve retention, teacher retention, and student learning. Kim, can you hit the next slide? And before I turn it over to Mary Dean, I just want to say a few things, and I suspect many of you on the Pepsi Commission know this, but I think there's about a handful of factors that really differentiate micro-credentials from most professional development that teachers experience. One is that the professional learning is focused on verifiable outcomes, not seat time requirements. The micro-credentials are based on evidence of impact in the classroom, not whether or not a teacher experiences a workshop, a course, or some training. The micro-credential expects teachers to actually conduct research. Action research is what we generally call it. Right, Dr. Dempsey? Research on the effects of their learning. So we actually have evidence in the micro-credential submissions that report on how teachers have studied the effects of their practice on student outcomes. If they're implemented effectively, they will encourage collaboration and self-paced learning. And importantly, they will offer educators more choice and voice. Mary Dean is going to help us kind of put all of this together and open it up for a conversation. Mary Dean?
Actually, I think I'm up next, Bart.
Oh, you are? Well, Bill, I was trying to get to Mary.
Bill, I was going into a panic mode.
That's right.
Okay.
Back to Bill. Thank you.
So as Myra mentioned, we don't have a lot of research yet. We should soon have some very good data coming out of the Empowering Learning Teachers project out at App State, where they are collecting data and have a very strong randomized control trial design research going on. But we do have some preliminary, impressionistic data, let's say, that we've learned, particularly the work that came out of the Friday Institute. And one of the things that showed up when they surveyed teachers who were taking their micro-credentials is that they were much more satisfied with their experiences with the micro-credentials than they were with the traditional professional development that they were experiencing. And importantly, I think they also found that these teachers, I think they were all classroom teachers, wanted to earn more micro-credentials. It was a positive attitude, and they were more likely to consider staying in their teaching positions. One of the other things that we've learned, and this has particularly come from the digital learning project out of DPI that Ashley oversees, is in their experience tells them that a big concern is they do not want to see teachers viewing micro-credentials as just one more thing they have to do. And that's related to the separation of micro-credentials and that experience from the current system of CEUs. And we also found that teachers often need incentives, whether these are in terms of professional advancement or stipends or whatever, again, because they already have so much on their plate and they have to make triage decisions about how they spend their time. We also found that teachers, and this, again, a lot of this comes from the experience of people at App State and the project they have going on, is that they found that teachers need a lot of guidance, especially in identifying appropriate micro-credentials and then understanding the process for earning them, as well as the need for learning resources. As Barnett was saying, this is an opportunity for them to actually carry out research on their own teaching, but they need support. Many of them need support in knowing exactly how to do that. The other thing that we've learned is that principals' understanding and support of educators who are pursuing micro-credentials is absolutely critical to their success. And fundamentally, what we're talking about is reinventing the current culture and structure of professional learning and moving from a compliance mindset to deep engagement in continual professional learning, moving from a passive attitude toward learning to a consistently active learning. Kim, can you move on to the next one? So what's very promising in a lot of ways is all of the assets that North Carolina can call on for achieving what it is that we want to achieve. We have a plethora of national board certified teachers. We have almost 23,500 in the state, and they come with skills that lend themselves to work on micro-credentials. There are, many of them are experienced assessors, and a critical element is having, as part of the micro-credential system, folks who are experienced in evaluating evidence of competency. And we are blessed with folks who already have those skills. And we also have taken a leading role. Digi-learning is very important in this, in pursuing the creation of quality assurance standards for micro-credentials. And again, this is something that is critical. Right now in the state, we don't have a set of standards. So the micro-credentials that are being offered are of undetermined quality, to be quite honest. And we need a way of defining what the quality assurance standards are and applying them to the micro-credentials. This is absolutely critical if the micro-credentials are to be transportable, that a micro-credential earned in Hyde County is recognized by the school districts in Cherokee, for example. And I've already mentioned the Empowering Teacher Learning Project at App State. They have gotten a jump start on the research that's needed in order to establish the potential effectiveness of micro-credentials. And we've also had districts that have been involved in this. Guilford has done some very good work. Wake, Charlotte Meck, I could go on there, Iredell has done a lot. There are already districts that have done enough work on this that they can be very informative as we move forward. And the North Carolina Center for the Advancement of Teaching, NCAT, is an obvious place to do a lot of this work. It's a well-established, well-regarded organization that has the potential to provide support to teachers, as well as to be a place where assessors, coaches, and so forth are trained.
So, Bill, I think this is me now.
Yeah, please.
Hi, everyone. Mary Dean Behringer, and it was great to work with all of the North Carolina colleagues on this. So I'm going to take you up 30,000 feet and sort of really very quickly go through the rationale and resources that are required for the recommendations for micro-credentials. And a lot of this right now is a high-level overview. It really supports a lot of what Bill and Barnett have already talked about, which is, what are the core principles that are undergirding our recommendations for this system. I think, they talked a lot about, this is a new kind of professional learning system. I think one of the things that we felt very strongly about in the recommendations is we see in other states that there's this quick reaction to where for professional learning, we've got to convert the micro-credential into the equivalent of a CEU. But we're really urging people to step back and not do this because we are trying to move, as Bill said, from a professional learning system that is largely compliant focused to one that is sort of the new C's, the competency based, continuous learning, and where there's control over your professional learning, which fits very nicely into the work that Ashley and Tom will talk about. There's a lot of things that we can leverage. The examples that Bill and Barnett gave, there is some research, but we really feel learning from our experiences that we did in national board certification in North Carolina when we were building that system is you really need to evaluate the implementation, research the impact in a much greater way than has been done in this field. And I think the most important thing is we need to think big, we need to start small, and we need to learn fast. And it's sort of always been our mantra that we will go as fast as we can in building a high quality state system, but only as fast as we can get it right. So when you move to the next slide, Kim, and you sort of look at these overall recommendations, I think, in particular, spending some time in the report on pages 23 and 25 really go into depth on that stage one of getting prepared. The stages provide a recommendation for a strategic framework. It's a state framework, and the recommendations also pay attention to ensuring that there is applied standard quality across the state and micro-credentials, but also an attention to equity. And equity, and we're thinking about equity, it's, making sure that in a state system, all the teachers in North Carolina have equitable access to micro-credentials and to the supports that Bill and Barnett have talked about that really enable the kind of powerful professional learning and change in teacher practice that impacts student learning. The other thing, if you wanted to move to the next slide, because there's just so much information here, I want to get to Ashley and Tom talking about how this is going to inform the pathways work, and then some questions from you. I think that when we were thinking about building this system out, we wanted to pay attention to three things. One is getting the infrastructure right that's going to sustain this project, doing it in a way that is what I call intentional scaling. So you see stage 4, it's expansion, but that's in 25, and then really looking at the continuous improvement and changes you might make to the system until it's really, you feel like it's really fully merged and can be made available statewide. And also then thinking, so it's the infrastructure, it's thinking about the intentional scaling of such a system and learning what the incentives may need to be that could be offered to encourage teacher participation in a new kind of professional learning that has great accountability to classroom practice and student learning. So I'm going to end here. I feel like I'm in a pilot that zoomed over your destination, but I want to allow some time for Ashley and Tom, and then we can open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Mary Dean, Bill, and Barnett. That was a nice overview of what the goal of this report was and how micro-credentials can play a role specifically in the work of the Pathways to Excellence. So from the beginning of this work, Dr. McBride and I kind of took kind of ownership of two streams that we see how MCs could play out moving forward. And the focus that I had was really in my capacity as overseeing licensure. Could micro-credentials be used as an alternative method for establishing competency to hold the license? So as you all know, we currently have one way to verify that the candidate is competent to hold the license, and that is a standardized test, a praxis content exam, and a pedagogy exam, the NTPA or the PPAT. And so the question became early on, could we possibly leverage actual performance in the classroom as a result of engaging in a micro-credential, the learning in the micro-credential, and then the demonstration of performance as part of closing the loop on that micro-credential? Could that somehow be leveraged for use of establishing competency to hold the license? And that's where, from my perspective on licensing, that's where I think my sense is the PEPC working groups have recognized that micro-credentialing could be a possible vehicle for that. And so the intent here is if we can set the standards and establish those skills and competencies that we're looking for to establish competency to hold the license, we could work to develop a suite of micro-credentials that could be used for that purpose. So I want to be very clear and reiterate that we don't see a set of micro-credentials as being a substitute for the knowledge base, as Dr. Dempsey refers to this quite often. And when we say knowledge base, that may be synonymous with an approved educator preparation program. We don't see that as supplanting that, but supplementing the verification that we currently have for those who complete those courses, the practice test. And so that's it in a nutshell. I'll turn it over to Dr. McBride to discuss more general professional learning and the micro-credentials.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody. That was a great overview. I think with the professional learning side of micro-credentials, one of the things that you see is it truly supports the Operation Polaris and talking about moving to competency-based learning for students. And if we're asking teachers to move to competency-based learning for students, then we should be looking at competency-based learning for professional development as well to help them understand that practice. In addition to that, these micro-credentials can really support educators as they're meeting individual learning goals. So just imagine that you're looking at a professional development plan, whether you're a principal or a coach, and being able to have those conversations with with an educator and say, this is a very specific, discrete skill that needs to be worked on, and you could earn that micro-credential. So you could work through any materials, you could do a various number of activities in order to gain that learning, but then also showing those practices in the classroom is what actually earns that micro-credential. So it helps to provide support for PDP goals and any other professional learning goals that the educator might have. In addition, we have a lot of educators in the state of North Carolina who are already fantastic at a lot of these skills, and having the ability to earn a micro-credential for something you're already doing in the classroom, that you don't have to go and sit down and have seat time in order to get professional learning credit for that piece. So if an educator I'm going to lean on the digital learning competencies and the CEUs that are often earned in that area, but say that you have an educator who is phenomenal at creating personalized pathways for their students. Maybe there's a micro-credential that talks very specifically about providing, using formative assessment to create pathways. If that is if that's something that educator is already doing, then by all means, they should be able to submit something, earn that micro-credential, and have that proof there. So that's really the vision of micro-credentials on the professional development side. The piece that we know that we're going to have, and I believe Bill talked about this earlier, is we need to make sure that there is support for this system and make sure that there are humans to help our teachers and our educators to understand how this type of system works, because it is very different than a seat-based system. I believe that is everything in a nutshell on the PD side. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to my Did You Learn friend, Myra.
Thank you all for a great job, and we will be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Myra, just real quick before we take questions, I want to clarify. I earlier in my statements, I kind of lumped EdTPA and PPAT in with a standardized content exam. That was not my intent. Those are more performance-based assessments that have a stronger connection, I think, to micro-credentials than a regular standardized test. So I just wanted to clarify that so folks didn't think that I was making that connection.
Thank you.
Are you ready for questions from the commission members?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Any questions or comments, commissioners? I have one. If there are no other, I'm checking to make sure hands are not raised. What is your next step in terms of how you're going to communicate this? Or is the next discussion with the General Assembly, or are there other stops before that or after that?
No, our relationship is with the state board and the department. We did this work at the request of the board. So the report we'll be doing, it's up to the board and the superintendent as to how they want to deal with this.
Okay. Thank you.
Chair Dempsey, this is Randy Penfield. I do have a question.
Sure.
It may be a question for Tom. Do we have any visibility at this point in terms of whether the path forward would be for there to be a single vendor that would work at the state level, to have a state level suite of micro-credentials that would be overseen at that level, or could there be multiple vendors or partners involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to limit my response to what I consider would be necessary for establishing licensure. I'm setting the professional learning renewal issues kind of separately from this. It seems to me that in order to establish whether this could be possible, at least initially in any kind of piloting of this, you would need probably one set of established micro-credentials and maybe a single vendor that would evaluate those. But then as we see whether this, once the proof of concept portion of that is established, I could see that, we have, what this group has done is establish standards, criteria for what constitutes a micro-credential. And then I could see the possibility as this grows and develops that other vendors and or providers might enter that space as long as they were adhering to those standards and those micro-credentials were aligned with the competencies we felt were important for establishing licensure. So at least initially, I think it would, for the proof of concept, it would need to be a single vendor. That would be the easiest to manage. But if this scales out and up across the state, you could see a space where multiple providers could do that.
I'd like to add to what Tom is saying, that we have had some discussions in a separate committee. We have a working group, and I recognize some of the names are in that working group with us for looking at the pathways work and professional development specifically in pathways. And this is something that we've been talking about on how we would roll such a thing out. There's different ways that we could look at this, but we want to make sure that whenever we do implement something like this, or if we're able to implement something like this, that we're providing as much freedom and choice as possible, and that we are allowing, we have school districts who are already doing micro-credentials, and they have some good micro-credentials out there. So we don't want to limit to a singular vendor for micro-credentials. We want to make sure that we're doing this in a way that there is as much choice and voice as possible.
Yeah, Randy, this is Mary Dean. I'll just share with you, some of the thinking from Barnett, Bill, and I when we were drafting the recommendations. As both Ashley and Tom mentioned, the critical feature is that you have a shared set of standards for quality assurance. And we were always thinking, and that there's some mechanism set up at the state level for oversight of those credentials and making some evaluation of the credentials that are out there. Like, do they meet these quality assurance standards? If not, what feedback do we give back to the developers, maybe at a local level, to bring them up so that there is comparability across the micro credentials. So I think it's less about how many vendors you have, and it's more about how do you put the system in place for oversight and quality assurance. And that's kind of a key part of our getting started and getting prepared to set up a statewide system.
Yeah.
Randy, this is Barnett Berry. I'm going to build a bit on what Mary Dean has suggested. I think somewhere in our 50-page report, we speak to the issue of a system that at one layer allows the state to kind of put forth, based upon its priorities, the micro-credentials that are befitting what the state is trying to accomplish. Then there could be another layer with districts, and then teachers themselves, and individually and in teams having kind of voice and choice. So I'd like to just kind of put an exclamation point on what Mary Dean had to say about not a kind of a one-size-fits-all system, but a system that's befitting the standards and making sure there's quality control.
As the chair of Pepsi, in thinking about the long view, I appreciate both the question and the responses. For 2 years, that has been an important part of Pepsi's discussion of micro-credentials. Particularly to the point that there has to be an expectation of a standard of practice and the educator's ability to meet that standard, and that's what needs to drive the integrity of a micro-credential. So I really appreciate those points. Any other questions or comments? Thank you to all of our presenters on the micro-credentials report. I will report as chair of Pepsi to the chair of the State Board of Education that we have had this presentation and seen the report, and I will communicate back to Pepsi any response from the State Board of Education that may impact ultimately the work of Pepsi in this space. Next, Dr. Evans will present policy amendments to LICN 003, licensing testing requirements that focus on vendor updates for 3 special education licensure exams, ending date for the Foundations of Reading subtest 090, and further clarification for the pedagogy assessment. Dr. Evans.
Thank you, Chair Dempsey. I'm going to just jump right in. with the Foundations of Reading ending date for 090. And I just wanted to remind everyone that the state board has already adopted the updated test 190, and so that is not on the table because the state board has already adopted that test in past months last year. Right now, 090 and 190 are the two subtests that are accepted to fulfill the reading subtest requirement for elementary education and ECGC or special education general curriculum licensure areas. And so the proposed date for the Foundations of Reading test 090 to be effective would be until July 31st, 2023. And this has come to be because Praxis or ETS, they will permanently retire the test, and it will be completely replaced with test 190. And then the testing available for test 090 would have to be complete by July 31st, 2023. I did want to note that that test 090, would be accepted by NCDPI licensure for 3 years from the July 31st, 2023 date. And so it would still be applicable for those two licensure areas to fulfill that subtest in case someone had taken that and it was past the July 31st, 2023 date, possibly in another state, or they had the results and they applied from out of state or after completing a program. And so our second piece of this policy amendment, a change, is around the PLT. And I know in the past we had already clarified the pedagogy assessment and that those requirements, the options for those requirements were the EdTPA or the PPAT. And so we were going through the policy, and some of the confusion is that the PLT still remains as a secondary licensure area testing requirement for the ones that are listed right here for those licensure areas. You can see it starts with anthropology and ends with sociology. So those areas still have the PLT, or the principles of learning and teaching. That test is still listed as a requirement, and we wanted to make sure that we clarify and remove that requirement so it doesn't cause confusion about which test is acceptable for the pedagogy assessment requirement. And so we have removed that from those particular secondary licensure areas to reduce this confusion. And I just wanted to note that testing workbooks for EdTPA are available for these secondary areas. And then the third piece is around vendor updates. And you can see the three tests right there, 5545, 5354, and 5543. These are the three special education or EC tests that are being replaced. And I just wanted to note before we get started that any lower cut score, it doesn't indicate any drop in standards. This has to do with the number of test items and the difficulty of those items for the updated test. So our first test is core knowledge and severe to profound applications test. And so the current test is 5545, and you can see the cut score and that it's effective. It would be effective until August 31st, 2024. And so the updated test would be severe to profound test 5547. The cut score for that test would be 156, and the effective beginning date would be September 1st, 2023. Note that this content exam is for special education adapted curriculum for that particular licensure area. So that's the first test change or update. And so the next two tests, they were replaced with one test. And I'll give the rationale around that on the last slide, on the summary slide. So the current test this is the core knowledge test, and this is 5543. You can see the cut score and the effective also until August 31st, 2024. And the updated test is the foundational knowledge test, 5355. The cut score for that updated test is 145, and the effective date is also September 1st, 2023. And this is for special education general curriculum, so ECGC. And then the last test is core knowledge and applications, and it's currently 5354, the same effective date. You can see the cut score there. And then the updated test is foundational knowledge test 5355, the same as the last test, and you can see the cut scores 145 with the same beginning date. And this is for exceptional children, cross-curricular licensure area. So it's the same as the ECGC, the previous slide. And I just wanted to make sure that we had a summary so you can kind of sum up what the policy amendments are, the retirement date for, 090, I'm sorry, it's not 190. 090 would be July 31st, 2023. And so that would be the last date of testing in North Carolina for that particular test. The Foundations of Reading 190 test is already adopted by the state board, so that is currently already an option. Then we'll have the removal of the PLT, the Principles of Learning and Teaching test, from the secondary licensure areas to better align with the pedagogy assessment requirement, and then updating the special education test. You can see it 5545 would be updated to 5547, and then you can see the two tests 5543 and 5554 would be updated to 5355. And so I reached out to Praxis or ETS and asked them about replacing two tests with one test. And they let me know that they have a national advisory committee for test when they decide to replace a test. And this particular national advisory committee was a panel of special education teachers and teacher educators, so from EPPs, that reviewed the standards and the composition of the test, and they decided that the one test would fulfill the requirement for both of the other tests. So they thought that it was more streamlined to have the one test than the two tests for these particular requirements, and that it was good around the mild to moderate disability areas for licensure. So I just wanted to give you that update, and these are the areas for the policy amendment for LICN 003. Any questions?
And this is Randy. I have a question. This is already done? Has the train left the station already?
No, this would need to be so this is up for recommendation by Pepsi today, and then it would need to go to the state board in April.
Okay. So my question, I think I had a similar question back when we were doing the Foundations of Reading, is with the switching of these tests, is there evidence of comparability between the scores? In other words, have these assessments, the old one and now moving to the new one, are they equated so that ETS is providing compelling evidence that the cut score remains at an analogous level of proficiency?
So they always provide a study that they conduct, and they have representatives from numerous states that help provide that norming study, and that's where they validate the items on the test and determine what the cut score will be. And I've attached that to the agenda items, and so that's where Praxis has made sure that things are validated and the norming of the cut score happens. Does that help?
And Dr. Evans, it does not lower the expected standard.
No. In fact, many times it increases the, it could increase the difficulty of the test itself, and it helps to update what the standards would be and what the components of that test include.
Thanks, Kim.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Penfield. Any other questions or comments before we go to a motion? Do I have a motion to approve the policy amendments to LICN 003 that provides an ending date for the Foundations of Reading Test 090 as of July 1, 2023, updates on special education tests 5345, 5545, and 5543, and further clarification for the pedagogy assessment to be sent to the State Board of Education in April 2023. Do I have a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second, Aaron.
Oh,
Thank you. Any other questions or discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? Thank you. The motion passes. Any other comments, Dr. Evans?
No, we are good to go.
All righty. Thank you. You will find in the documents for the meeting today a letter that I have received as Pepsi chair that was also sent to Eric Davis, the chair of the State Board of Education, related to work by the governor's DRIVE task force. DRIVE is the statewide effort to create and support and retain greater numbers of teachers of color in the education profession across North Carolina. We have received that letter. He and I have discussed how to proceed with that letter. The first step that we're going to take with the letter is for it to come before Pepsi. Pepsi is the primary recipient of the letter and information it contains from the DRIVE task force, and it's their recommendations for consideration to Pepsi and then ultimately to the State Board of Education. You have received that document to give you time to digest the document in preparation for it being an agenda item for information at the April Pepsi meeting. So we will have that on the agenda. It will be for information only at that point in any discussion that we may have, including what we might communicate back to Dr. Anthony Graham, the chair of the DRIVE task force, and forward to the State Board of Education, but we would not take action on the document at that meeting. So I did want to share that as it is in the documents for today's meeting. It will be an agenda item for the April meeting. Any questions about the DRIVE task force letter at this point? And Dr. Graham, I don't think is with us today, but I do want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work and leadership that he has provided to the DRIVE task force work. I serve on the executive committee of that along with him, and they have done outstanding work in that effort. Thank you, commission members, advisors, and staff for your preparation for the discussions today. I remind commission members that our next monthly meeting will be held virtually on Thursday, April 13th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. We have now completed our meeting, and unless there is additional business at this time, I will ask for a motion to adjourn.
This is Craig. I make a motion to adjourn.
Thanks, sir.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you all, and please have a great rest of the day.